So this is Claire Marsland, Organisational Development Manager at Plus Dane Housing, and you're listening to the Academy's Developing Practice podcast.
Hello, in this episode, myself, Matthew Davies, an organisational developer, and Alex Owen, an academic developer, sat down with Claire Marsland, Organisational Development Manager at Plus Dane Housing. We discussed how Claire used hybrid working practices during her various stages of her career. We hope you enjoy. Hi Claire, and welcome back to the University of Liverpool. Today we are discussing about hybrid working and the realities of working from mixed locations. But before we hear that, if we can just have a little bit about your professional background and the role that you're in today.
Hi, Matt. Hi, Alex. And it's absolutely lovely to talk to you. So, my current role, I'm Organisational Development Manager at Plus Dane Housing. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on. But if we go back to sort of the start, if you like, of my working life, I actually started out as an analytical biochemist. I was a research technician at Sheffield University, in fact. And I did that for a few years and then relocated to the Northwest and started to work with United Utilities. It was actually Northwest Water back then, but United Utilities working in the laboratories. I was actually there for about 12 years in all. And although I went in the laboratories, when I had finished, I was working in HR, and sort of the journey went from, how do you come out of the laboratory and into HR? It's not necessarily an obvious step, but it actually was through a change management role when the laboratory service across the whole Northwest was centralised, and I joined the team that was part of that and decided that I actually quite liked the HR and the people aspects of work. So I gradually moved into HR, and when I left there, which was in the early 2000s, I was responsible for kind of senior management, development and succession planning for the whole group. So that was very much my journey into HR and OD. After that, I worked, I was self-employed for, it was actually about 10, 11 years. Sometimes working as an associate for other organisations and all the time alongside that kind of building up my own clients and working for them. So I worked in the NHS, I worked in a number of medical charities. I did a lot of work in the third sector actually, especially around environmental charities. Did a little bit of work at another university and actually for a housing organisation, which was quite helpful for where I am now. That was all really, really interesting. 2014, I actually went back into employment. I worked as a HR and OD consultant for National Union of Students for 5 years. That was great. Did a lot of travelling. That involved working with lots of different students' unions to support their HR and their people work. I left there and then came to the university for a year, which is where we met. Worked for the Academy as an organisation developer. And then 7 months ago, I started my current role with Plus Dane, which has been interesting because this has all been during the COVID pandemic. But in terms of what does my role involve? Well, my role is really to make sure that we've got the culture and the systems in place to support our people delivering the best possible service that we can to our customers and our tenants. So what that means is it takes in making sure that we've got the right kind of staff engagement, the right kind of learning and development, performance, leadership, change management and culture. It's bringing together all of those things in a way that supports people to be able to deliver their role and their professional functions in the best way that they possibly can.
Brilliant. So you've had a lot of varied roles there. So some in the private sector, some in public sector, then you've been self-employed. So I
Yeah.
guess your modes of working throughout your career have changed an awful lot depending on the role that you're in. So I think
Yes.
it's ideal that we speak to you about hybrid working, because you would have been doing some forms of that probably 10, 20 years ago, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. Yes. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Actually, and both as a self-employed person, as a consultant, but also in employment to some extent as well, certainly at NUS. So yeah, in both of those different contexts.
What we're finding, Claire, at the moment is there's a lot of discussion, as you can imagine, across the university about how we're going to be working in the future. And it's really interesting that your role at the moment is supporting an organisation to work out the kind of strategy to support people to develop their roles.
Yeah.
And I guess that's part of the conversation we're trying to have as well, across the university at the moment. So hearing about your work in terms of your experience of mixed modalities, is something that we're, really trying to think about in terms of people working remotely and also working on site. And we're calling that kind of hybrid working as we explore that. But at the moment, most of us at the university, not all of us, but a lot of us are still online. So we're just starting to think about going back onto campus and what that might look like. Can you tell us about some of the benefits that you've seen from your experience of working this way?
Yeah, certainly. So I think from a personal perspective, it gives you more freedom to be able to work in the way that best suits you. We all probably know there are times of the day or even times of the week that you feel more engaged and motivated and switched on, and ideas are flowing and things are easy. And you can take advantage of those times. And maybe when things aren't flowing as well, or that you maybe have a dip at a certain time of day, you can kind of work around that and you can accommodate that within your working day. And I found that really, really probably to be the most beneficial aspect of all. I think there's also something in there around being able to incorporate other parts of your life that are important. It's not just about when do I work best or when do I know I need to take a break? But I think one of the things that it's making us do, all of us, and it certainly made me do, is think about your whole life and all of the things that are in there. It can be sometimes people experience it as a problem to sort of have to mix work and home life in this new way. But if you can begin to think about it in the context of your whole life and all the things that you like to do, or all the things that you need to do, whether it would be families and children or other commitments that you might have, or exercise or whatever it might be, it gives you a way to be able to incorporate more of that in a kind of guilt-free way, I would say. So I think being plunged, if you like, into this way of working before many organisations had a chance to really think about it. In some respects, has been difficult, but I think it's been good because it's forced people to have to do it and to see how it can work. And I think if you can take that mindset on it, then it's quite helpful. I think from the organisation's perspective as well, it's really interesting that there's long been a debate around agile working, hybrid working, working from home, and what that does to the relationships between the individual, their line manager, with teams. Will people actually work and do what they need to do? And will the outcome and performance be the same, or will it be different? And I think it's made us do it, hasn't it? We've had to actually just plunge right in and do it. And from my perspective, I think it seems to be working really well. I think that debate and that conversation around, can we trust, can we let go, can we release people to be professional, and can we trust people? The answer is absolutely yes, we can, because it's working. And I see it working in our organisation, and I'm sure that's replicated across many organisations. And I think that's really quite liberating and interesting and exciting. The other thing I would say, and I'd like to claim this as an original thought, but it's not. It was a conversation I heard on the radio the other day, which was lots of organisations were already talking about agile working, hybrid working, and there's been a gradual move towards that for many years, hasn't there? But actually, the experience of doing this in a pandemic is not the same as it will be or would be without those circumstances. So I do wonder that where we've got situations where maybe people are struggling with it and really finding it difficult is to try and maybe think about all those difficulties, because we're all just in a really difficult and stressful situation anyway, and people are coping with all sorts of things in their lives, and the whole environment is very, very difficult. It may be different when things start to open up and we start to go back into being able to, you know, in your case, being on campus more often. It may feel different without that backdrop to it. We may find that it is actually much more positive than we ever thought it would be.
Yeah, I think you're right. And even, I mean, as we're recording now, the children are still off school, aren't they? So for me, you know, I'm trying to support my daughter with her GCSE chemistry, which is me trying to remember many, many years ago in terms of what I was learning. But once she's back at school, actually, I think that flexibility that you're talking about will be really, really nice. For example, since the girls have been at school, I've never been around at 4 o'clock when they come home from school just to say hi, even just for 10 minutes. And that's been really lovely when they were back in school back before Christmas, just being here when they got home, just to take 10 minutes, you know, have a drink, catch up, and then go back to work has been really nice to have that ability to be agile. So I think what you're saying there, particularly of the experience we're in at the moment, is potentially not what we'll be living with in terms of a hybrid model moving forward, particularly for those colleagues who've got children at home at the moment, maybe.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's exactly right. But I think, you know, it also highlights some of the benefits, you know, as you describe, even just that 10 minutes where you would not normally be around just to have that conversation and for them to see you and to see how you're working and structuring your life and making everything work that you need to work, you need to work out. It's such a positive thing, I feel. I know it's not without its stresses and strains, and I know there are lots of parents who are delighted that the schools are going to be opening again in a couple of weeks, but there are a lot of positives to it if we can try and see it that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've mentioned a couple of times, Claire, that obviously a lot of organisations were already thinking or moving towards this way of working, commonly known as Agile. We're calling it hybrid. And some were probably on the cusp of implementing this sort of hybrid culture at the point where the pandemic began. So what challenges did you come across when you were working in this way in your various roles before the pandemic hit?
It can be lonely, particularly if you're struggling with something and you don't necessarily have a colleague just to turn to and just say, oh, do you know, what do you think of this? Or even something like, would you just read this email because I'm struggling to get the words right? That kind of mutual support that you get when you're working in the same physical environment or space as other people, that can be a real miss. So I think that's probably one of the big ones, actually. Sometimes as well, you know, especially if you're a consultant and you're working on your own, so you're not part of a wider team, that you know, just working from home, the pressures can build up quite a bit because it's actually on you. You've taken on that role, you've taken on that project, that job or whatever, and you have to deliver. And if you don't deliver, particularly if you're self-employed, that can have a significant impact on whether you'll get another job, on your kind of reputation and profile. So there can be pressures to work through. That's sometimes difficult. And I can remember times when, you know, especially where I've had maybe 2 or 3 things to deliver and things take longer than you think they're going to take. I'm finding myself burning the midnight oil and and feeling quite pressurized at times. So I think that's part of it, perhaps. I think also just the sort of the anchor of having a kind of a team around you of people who understand the context that you're all working in and have got some common aims and objectives and understand, the sort of the nuances of this or that situation. That's all part of working life, and it can be absent when you working at home or on your own. So that's what I would say would be the main challenges, I think, that I personally experienced.
So that point you made at the beginning about isolation, how did you overcome that, or did you even manage to overcome that isolation at that point?
Well, in some ways, yes. In some ways, no. I think part of this, I think, is about knowing yourself, to be honest. And I know that I'm a kind of fairly self-reliant sort of person. So perhaps it didn't bother me as much as it might have done for other people who are much more socially focused and have that need to sort of be around people. So I think there's partly something about my natural sort of nature or personality kind of helped to make it work. I always put a lot of effort into kind of networking and building relationships. And I don't mean the sort of the kind of salesy type of networking and sort of the self-promotion aspects, but building up relationships with people who had similar professional interests or worked in a similar way, so they understood the sort of issues. For me, and actually how I always developed my business at the time, was really around building those important, like valuable relationships, authentic relationships with people. And because of that, I never felt quite as isolated as it might otherwise have felt. I mean, obviously, one of the things about being a consultant is that you are working on your own, but often you're not. You're out there at your customers and your clients' premises, and you're working with teams or individuals there. So I mean, actually, that's great, because you get to, especially if you're a bit of a nosy Parker, you get to see, inside all sorts of organisations and all sorts of wonderful places that you might never otherwise get into, and talk to people and work with people, a far greater range of people than you might otherwise have done. So it swings and roundabouts, I guess. But yeah, relationships, I think it has to be, you have to work at it. You have to work at building that network around you in a way that best suits you.
I like what you're saying there, Claire, about understanding you and kind of how you operate as an individual, and then what will work for you and what doesn't. And one of the key aspects that some colleagues have fed back to us about this recent move online is the impact that it's had on their well-being. Yeah. And for some colleagues, it's been brilliant. They've got their work-life balance back, they've cut out their commute, they're able to do more exercise, they're able to go for walks with friends. And for others, it's been really isolating. They've struggled to separate their work and their life and never leaving the home, and it's had a really negative impact. Is that something that you found?
Yeah, definitely. And really interesting that we've just done a staff survey at Plus Dane, for example, and found this exact same findings. For some people, it's worked really well. They're enjoying not having to commute, having that extra time for all of the things that we've discussed already in our conversation. But for others, it's been a very different experience, and they really don't like it for all sorts of different reasons. Partly, I would hope that as lockdown is released and the pandemic hopefully starts to move away, then it will feel different for those colleagues. But I think there is a responsibility on us as an organisation, any organisation, to really kind of really try to engage with those people and understand where the problems are, what the stresses and strains are, and try as much as possible to put things into place to mitigate their distress or their unhappiness about the situation. I know one of the things I've been really interested to see since I've moved to Plus Dane is the amount of work that we do around wellbeing support, and particularly support for mental health. And I think that whole movement in society, which is happening it's happening now, but it's been building pace for a couple of years, hasn't it? Has been really, really positive and really helpful. And I think if we can provide different forums, or fora is probably the word, isn't it, for people to have these kind of conversations, and as organisations that we're equipping the line managers to be able to have these really sensitive, nuanced conversations with individuals, then it's really, really important to supporting their well-being, because as you say, it just doesn't suit everybody. It really doesn't.
No, absolutely. And I think one of the key things that colleagues are missing are those kind of informal conversations that you have when you're actually on campus, over the coffee or over the photocopier. And it's really hard to replicate that, isn't it, on an online forum. I noticed, Matt, you put something on Twitter the other day where you'd set up a kind of informal chat using some kind of technology, and no one had turned up. So Matt was there at the bar by himself. And it's a really great idea doing stuff like that, but people find it much, much harder to engage kind of informally, don't they, when they're working online. Have you got any ideas around that, Claire, that could help us to kind of foster those kind of supportive relationships in the workplace?
Yeah, it is a really difficult one, isn't it? And it's, I suppose, even just going back to something I mentioned before about when you've got that little question about, oh, what do you think about this? Where you just turn to somebody and you can't do it in the same way. And you don't necessarily want to pick up the phone or because you don't know what they're doing, and you might be disturbing them, and you maybe feel, well, it's not important enough to say, to ask the question or disturb them. Or just those really funny conversations that you end up having about something that you watched on the television or something somebody said. It's all part of the sort of social glue in the organisational life, isn't it, that makes coming to work so interesting and enjoyable, sometimes annoying, but it's all part of it, isn't it? The kind of things I've seen people doing is just making sure you still have those team meetings, even if they're just 30 minutes where you're just doing the general catch up, or that it's okay to have the space to talk about what was on the television or what people did at the weekend, not necessarily where it takes hours out of people's day and it feels intrusive, but just 30 minutes, 20 minutes here. I actually do really like the chat facility on, we use Teams, for example, but just using that chat facility just to say, oh, do you mind, could you have a look at this, or what do you think about that? I really quite like that, because it makes me at least feel connected with others. We've been doing things like having sort of short quizzes, sort of posting up music and things that we like, kind of mood, what's your kind of favorite mood boosting music, all that sort of stuff, just to try and recreate that in some way. And that's been quite helpful. Maybe it's not the same as being in the same physical space, but it goes some way towards it, I think, which is quite nice.
Yeah. I think one of the things I miss about working with you, Claire, is that we did often used to turn our chairs around and face each other and talk through problems on a regular basis. We do it at least once a day, and that is missing. That I don't talk through my issues anymore. I tend to try and just tackle them and deal with them, and sometimes that goes right, sometimes it might go wrong, but there's nobody to sound off at the moment. It's a bit of an echo chamber in some respects.
Yeah.
Go on.
No, I was going to say, I know what you mean, because I always really valued that, Matt. I really did. I used to love our conversations. And actually, now you say that, it makes me reflect on something. which is, I think, for me, one of the most enjoyable aspects of work, is actually those type of conversations, those kind of intelligent, professional, insightful conversations that you have with colleagues. I think is so rewarding, and yeah, I think that is my favorite part of work.
Yeah,
I do. I do. We used to have some great conversations, didn't we?
We did, and we know we'd go out and we'd have chats with people, and then we'd bring that back in, and we'd problem solve it together, which was, really a beneficial thing to do. And some of that which is missing. One of the other things as well, another conversation I had recently with a colleague actually, who said when they first started to work from home at the beginning of the pandemic, they found it difficult to work at home because it was so quiet, and they were missing that office hum, that that sort of hubbub that going around. And now, after a while, they got used to that, and now they think when they go back into an office, they might struggle with that because they've got used to having no distractions. Yeah,
I can see that actually, because I do. I must admit, I love to have quiet, private space to work in, and I can absolutely see that it would work that way. I do think actually, you've raised a really interesting point there, because I think when the time comes when we can go back into the campus or the office environment more than we can now, I think it's going to feel really quite weird for a lot of people in lots of different ways. It almost feels like we're going to have to do something to help people reestablish those relationships with one another and those ways of working. And I think it'll take a little while before it feels natural again in the way that it did before. And that's quite interesting. I don't know what that would look like, but I think it's something we should be thinking about.
Yeah, I agree. So in a recent podcast, we had a discussion with David Pastor, the CEO of Claire House, and he said something really interesting that struck a chord with me. And it was that we are all in the storm at the moment, but some of us are in different boats. And that got us thinking about the equality and diversity aspects of what people are finding throughout this pandemic. So do you have any reflections on the hybrid model from your experience for our disabled colleagues?
Is just that you really need to have the very sensitive conversations with those individuals and work out what is right for them in that situation, because I don't think there is a one size fits all. I think each individual set of circumstances will be different according to the nature of the person, the person, their personality, their preferences, the way they work, the role they do. Is it something that requires them to be out and about traveling, or is it something that is more sort of desk based? And I think the nature of the disability. So I think it's always about that conversation, that it's about sitting down with them going, what do you need to help you work at your best and be your best in this situation? And sometimes it can be, from my experience in this particular situation, sometimes it can be really, really small sort of practical adjustments. Needn't necessarily be big changes to working hours or anything like that, although it might be. But I think it's just about having that conversation with the individual, and the line manager, which it probably would be in the vast majority of cases, having the confidence and the sensitivity to be able to have a really good conversation, because ultimately what we're about is about helping that individual to be able to work at their best and make their best contribution given the circumstances. And how do we facilitate that?
And I guess along those lines as well, I was talking to a disabled colleague, and they were saying that they don't want to return to campus, that actually it's worked really, really well with them being at home. So I guess the same applies in that, having that conversation again with their line manager of, this has worked really well for me. My output in terms of my work hasn't reduced, and trying to have that open conversation around maybe having some kind of hybrid model rather than just the thought that they will go full-time back onto campus as well, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, it is absolutely about having that conversation. And I think if we have established, and I don't know if we have, but I think we have, if we've established that actually you can trust people to behave like, professional adults, which we all are. We all manage all sorts of things in our life, don't we? Every day, all sorts of challenges and delights. If we accept that premise that we're all responsible professional adults, we have an open conversation about what's needed and what's going to work best in that situation. And so, sometimes, there may need to be some middle ground. But it's about having the conversation and having it with a genuine, honest intent, I think, to get the best outcome all around.
So do you think there'll be a move towards kind of managers managing by outcomes rather than presenteeism, in terms of what you're talking about with trusting staff?
I do think that, yeah, very definitely. And I think it's started to happen. And I think I'm hoping that it's kind of released that pent-up tension, if you like, that a lot of managers and maybe some organisations had around this type of working. I hope we will all see the benefits much more holistic benefits for everyone working in this way. I definitely think there'll be a big move more explicitly towards managing by outcomes. And that will be a bigger shift for some organisations than others. But yeah, I definitely do think that. And I really welcome it as well. I think it's in everyone's interests if we can do that. Who knows what we might end up being able to do.
It's been great to have that chat with you, Claire. And we ask every guest on the podcast the same question at the end. And that is, if you've got three or four take-home tips that the listeners could reflect on in terms of their own personal practice, what would they be in terms of hybrid practice?
Okay, so I think one of the important things is around boundaries and setting boundaries, particularly when you are working from home, and working out what works for you in making that separation between work and home. For some people, that's a really, really important thing to do, to make sure that work doesn't encroach to a degree that becomes unhelpful or difficult or just overwhelming for you. And there are lots of things that people can do to help with that. Even simple things, like putting your laptop away in the evening or completely out of sight in a cupboard at the weekend, so that you're not tempted necessarily to keep going back. Not everyone has necessarily got a separate room to be able to work in, but that can be helpful. But if you haven't, it's just to work out how to create a boundary between home and work that works for you. I think the other thing is seeing hybrid working, agile working as an opportunity to integrate the whole of all the different aspects of your life together in a much more interesting and creative way than is simply work, home. I think it removes some of the barriers and the time frames and allows us to be a lot more flexible about what we do. And I think that's really exciting and interesting and much more fulfilling personally. I think certainly the third tip would be, even if you are somebody who is quite self-contained and self-reliant, is to really make sure that you do keep up those relationships, because they help us with our creativity, they stimulate our thinking, they keep us human, they keep us engaged, and that's really, really important in work, I think. And then I think the final one would be just to know yourself and try and, if you know that you're getting tired and you need to stop, then stop. If you are struggling to do something, take a break. I don't know how many times I've been struggling to maybe write a paper or just construct an email that might be a little bit sensitive, and then sort of ping, the light goes on. This is not working because you're tired or you've had enough. It's been a busy day. You've been on a Zoom call for 2 hours or whatever. And then you put it aside, have a break, or think I'll come back to it in the morning. And it's something that you can do very easily and very quickly. And it's recognizing, I think, in yourself when you're not at your best and making the choice to just say, I'll leave it for now. I think and if you can do that, that's really important as well.
Brilliant. It's been great to catch up, Claire, and thanks very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Claire.
Oh, thank you. It's been lovely to catch up with both of you too, and thank you for asking me.
Well, it was great to catch up with Claire and discuss the many benefits that come from hybrid working. And she did also talk about that isolation that hybrid working could bring. And obviously then we went on to discuss the many ways around this. And she pointed out that a couple that worked for her was knowing yourself and what works for you, and the importance of building networks of support and finding creative ways to build authentic relationships. I thought they were really great bits of advice.
Yeah, absolutely. I really enjoyed catching up with Claire as well. I like what she said about one of the best bits of working on site are those insightful, intelligent, kind of informal conversations. And we seem to be missing those a little bit now. So we need to start thinking about ways that we can recreate that as we move to a hybrid pattern. So I'm definitely going to think about that in terms of enhancing my future practice. Well, there's lots in that conversation that you may want to take further and think further about. And to do that, we've added some resources to the website on a specific podcast reading list, which you can access at liverpool.ac.uk/the-academy/podcast. So do check those out. Also, let us know what you thought about this episode. You can tweet us at LiveUniAcademy, and you can also find us at eLearnerMatt or at Alexandra_Owen on Twitter.
Definitely. And we're really grateful, as usual, for those who have taken the time to either rate or review our show in your podcast provider's app. So if you're an Apple user, please do take the time to review our show, as it will help others find us. Bye for now.